Good morning, Bob. I'm glad I ran into you this morning. I read in the business section that the Federal Reserve is printing money.
Oh yeah, they've been doing that for years.
Okay, but shouldn't that be illegal? I mean, that sounds like counterfeiting.
Not at all. Counterfeiting is when a private citizen manufactures money in his basement for a B-rated movie. Printing money is when the Federal Reserve artificially increases the money supply.
How can the Fed print money, legally, when the B-rated movie actor gets arrested at the airport by the FBI with the counterfeit money in his duffel bag?
Because the Federal Reserve doesn't really print it, they just electronically create it out of thin air and credit the banks with the money.
And that's not counterfeiting?
No.
And it's perfectly legal?
Exactly.
And what's backing the fake money created by the Federal Reserve?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Not a damn thing.
This doesn't make any sense. Why would they do that?
Because the Fed gives the fake money to the banks so they can lend it to American consumers to buy more shit they can't afford.
So why aren't people buying more shit they can't afford?
Because the banks don't give a rat's ass if Americans buy anything or not.
You lost me.
Just think about it for a moment. 5 years ago everyone had a big house, nice cars, a 50-inch flat-screen TV. And no damn money.
It's a beautiful country.
And all those mortgages and car notes and credit card debts were used as collateral for bonds.
That's dumb.
No, dumb is when you bought a $600,000 house on a $70,000 income.
I only paid $550.
Oh, that changes everything, except the fact that you still lost your house.
Condo.
In any event, all that debt was used as collateral for 38% of the bond market. The bonds were referred to as asset-backed securities and the banks made up the prices of these bonds themselves.
If I understand you correctly, the banks lent me money to buy the house I couldn't afford and used the mortgage I couldn't pay to collateralize bonds they sold to unsuspecting investors.
Yes.
Then the banks made up the price themselves.
Yes.
Okay, but what about the free markets?
Free markets are only important when politicians want to pass pro-business legislation, not when businesses need the government's help. So when people didn't pay their mortgages, the bonds on the balance sheets of the banks weren't worth jack shit and the banks claimed the money they would have otherwise lent to consumers went up in smoke.
I don't see the connection.
Well, the Fed thought that if the banks couldn't lend anyone money, the economy would collapse.
But what does any of this have to do with printing money?
The Federal Reserve used the electronically created money and bought the asset-backed securities that weren't worth jack shit in the free markets because the banks needed liquid assets to lend to consumers.
To buy more shit they couldn't afford.
Which is why they didn't lend it to them.
What?
The Federal Reserve gave the banks fake money in exchange for the asset-backed securities, but instead of lending the money to consumers, they used the proceeds to invest in the stock market.
That's straight up gangster.
And that's why the stock market has been going up. When the Fed creates currency out of thin air, the value of the dollar goes down, and if you look at a chart of the value of the dollar and the stock market, you'll see that they move in the opposite direction. As one goes up, the other goes down.
Run that by me again.
The banks take the fake dollars that increases the money supply and correspondingly reduces the value of the dollar. Then they use that money to buy stocks. As the demand for stocks goes up, so do the prices.
And that's printing money.
It used to be referred to as printing money, but now they call it quantitative easing.
As in get a bottle of wine and some Barry White music.
No, as in the Fed buys the toxic assets off the balance sheets of the banks like we just discussed.
Why can't they say printing money?
Because the American public figured out that printing money was a bad thing, began to dress up in silly George Washington costumes and demand fiscal responsibility.
Go on.
Then the financial industry came up with another catchy slogan, because investors pay more attention to the private life of Tiger Woods than they do their portfolios. Remember the Goldilocks economy, the smooth landing, and that bullshit about the green shoots theory?
Yes, but I always thought that when the Federal Reserve expands the money supply, it causes inflation. So why haven't we seen interest rates go up?
Because the Federal Reserve also lends the banks more fake money that isn't backed by anything of value at 0.25%.
And let me guess.
The banks instead lend the same money back to the broke-ass government by purchasing treasury bonds that pay 3%.
Nobody's that stupid.
Studies show that 1/5 of Americans can't locate the United States on a map.
That's an anomaly.
But That's 20% of the population who don't know where the hell they live.
What does that have to do with the Federal Reserve lending money to the banks, that the banks in turn use to buy treasury bonds?
Well, it seems the government owes $13.5 trillion and has a $1.5 trillion budget deficit.
And you talk about my bad financial decisions?
You can't print money.
You can't grow facial hair.
So the government borrows money by selling bonds to China and Japan, but foreign countries are beginning to realize we can't pay it back. To compensate for the decreasing international demand for our debt, the Federal Reserve gives fake money to the banks so they can use it to buy government bonds.
So the first batch, quantitative easing, wasn't enough, so now they're
printing money.
Printing money to lend to the banks so the banks can lend it back to the broke-ass government.
Yes. You see, the government has to refinance 36% of its debt in 2010.
And Bernie Madoff is in jail because?
And 60% of the debt will mature over the next 3 years.
Why does this sound familiar?
Essentially, this is the adjustable rate mortgage crisis on steroids, because more than half of the United States obligations come due by the end of 2013, and right now the government pays 1.25% on that debt, which will probably be refinanced at higher rates.
No, this sounds more like money laundering. The Federal Reserve manufactures illegitimate money and funnels it through the banks, so they can give it to the government in a more legitimate form. If you or I did this, we would go to jail. How did you learn all of this? It seems awfully complicated.
I read Ivory Johnson's DCExaminer.com column.
You read what?
It's Examiner.com for Washington, D.C. in the business section, written by Ivory Johnson.
He must be one sharp guy.
No, I met him. He drinks too much and still believes in Santa Claus.
Oh. Well, at least he knew enough to use extranormal.com.